I'm Patrick Ewers. I'm the founder and CEO of Mindmaven, an executive coaching firm that focuses on helping startup leaders and CEOs free up over 12 hours a week by changing the way they work with an EA or chief of staff. But more importantly, to then use that freed up time to invest into relationships, because we believe you don't know a single person who's been able to reach their fullest potential without help from others. And so today I have another really distinguished guest with us on the topic of human first leadership.
My name's Amit Bhatia.
Amit Bhatia, exactly. And he's the co-founder of Datapeople, which is a recruiting and language analytics platform focusing really on helping people hire the right people. And many people would argue, well, that sounds like a pretty crowded space. But I think what is unique about what you do is that you really want to make it more efficient and particularly more fair for everyone, right? And
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That's really interesting because I think very few people actually in that industry focus on that. So I'm glad to have you here. And
I'm glad to be
why
here.
don't I start off with asking you the question that I always lead off with, and that is, what does human first leadership mean to you? How has it expressed itself in your life?
I really appreciate you asking that. I love the phrase human first leadership. I mean, we've seen a lot of different types of leadership we talk about. And so when I reflected on it, I've had every possible career. I've been a software engineer doing neural nets before anyone called it AI or machine learning. I've done investment banking. I've done trading and I've traded bonds, and I've started a company. And through my experiences in lots of different geographies and companies and careers, I've realized everything in sort of the corporate world is designed to treat people like they're infants. Like there's an infantilization of our corporate culture. And maybe because it stems from most of our corporate routines, the Monday to Friday, the 9 to 5 stem from sort of a very early industrial age, very early manufacturing age. And it hasn't ever evolved since then. But to me, all the structures, the bureaucracy, the red tape, the meetings, the petty politics, they're all designed to treat us like we're less than adults, as if we're not trusting. And so to me, human first leadership when I started a company was really, how do I build a company of grown-ups? How do we treat people? We spend and give so much of our lives to working, to our careers, to our jobs. How do we actually get the best out of people by giving them the autonomy, the freedom, the flexibility, and often the mandate and responsibility to really feel like the grown-ups that they are?
Yeah, okay. Do you have an example of like a classic case where companies treat us as infants versus this is what it should be? This is how you were to do it in sort of we treat people like grown-ups?
I think for a long time, we took for granted that you had to work out of an office. And for a long time, we took this idea that productivity, learning, apprenticeship, creativity can only occur in the confines of an office. And maybe there's some element of collaboration that's absolutely true, but we didn't just stop and say we must work collaboratively or co-work together. We enforced on people that their productive juices must start at 9 o'clock and they must finish at 5, and they must have lunchtime at prescribed hours, that they must sort of fit into the model of a world that somebody described. And in doing so, and we just, as a society, we took this for granted for years and years and years. And it took the awfulness of a pandemic for us to say, hang on a second, could we work differently? The tools were all there for years, but it really took an exogenous event like that for us to question. And even now, we still don't, there's still sort of like a turmoil in our society about which way are we going to eventually go. But to me, that's one of the those radical points of infantilization is when you force people to be in a certain area, in a certain space, in a certain geography, arbitrarily, without considering that they're full humans with responsibilities, with caregiving, with different schedules, with different ways of working. We are basically asking everyone to almost like be treated like kindergartners. You kind of show up, and we're going to sort of, and that feels wrong.
Yes. Okay. Ooh, I need to drill into this because so for example, right now, if we look at this time, I think we're seeing that turmoil, right? Like where large organizations, very powerful organizations, are actually really trying every way possible to force people back into the office,
And it's
right?
not clear why.
And then my question is, why are people doing this? Like, why is that the standard mode of operating? It seems for the organization to treat humans not as that person can do their work on their own. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever, what are the root causes that basically drive this way of behaving in the corporate world?
I have, and the only thing I can think of is that the power structures of most companies are not designed towards innovation, and that's by design. They're
I see.
designed, they're not designed towards innovation, and that's
Okay.
by design. So, most companies achieve some degree of, they find a product, or they find an area which is enormously profitable for them. That's why
Mm-hmm.
they've become these large organizations. And after that, their incentive structures and their entire organizations are sort of designed to sort of, you know, prevent that golden egg from being destroyed. And and it is in that we sort of end up with these, we end up with a very sort of top-down military organization that sort of mimics in all of these corporations. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that's the only way we can work. That's the only way. And I think that's just there's an evolution. Like we've seen, it takes a critical mass of companies, of leaders to
Mm-hmm.
start to say, hang on a second, what could you do if you thought of the world differently? What
Yeah.
could you achieve if you thought of the world with creativity?
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of we allowed people to step up, but you have to sort of really devote yourself to that sort of idea. You have to really experiment with it. There've got to be vanguards in our society that are trying it. And there have been, even before the pandemic, there were very, very successful, fully remote companies
Yes.
all
Absolutely.
over, from Shopify to whatever else. There were very successful companies. But it takes a critical mass of them before people say, hang on, this is the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But change doesn't come easy in any part of our society. So why are we surprised that it doesn't come easy in sort of in very old and traditional corporate practice?
It's really interesting. I think what you say resonates with me really deeply because I founded Mindmaven in 2008, and from the first day on, it was a fully remote company at a time where people thought that just could never work, right? And I think while my organizations may be smaller than like something like GitHub, it's still a living testament that it can work and that you can be very productive. One other I think why or one sort root source is that there seems to be a fundamental general distrust that organizations have towards their people.
That's right.
Right. And that they and then the other fact is that they are fearing that loss of control.
That's right.
Control over the use of the time because I bought your time. And in itself, it's a very immature way of thinking because you just can't get the maximum out of people when you operate on that one. You
Well, it's a
basically,
shop floor way of thinking,
it's a
right?
what?
Like it's a shop floor way of thinking. It's the
Yeah.
way you thought when you had people on a shop floor,
Yes.
and it was their time was directly translated to productivity. But
Mm-hmm.
today, we puzzle on problems that aren't that they're not correlated with time. Like our ability to unlock some of these puzzles are not correlated with how much time we spend on a specific, or how many lines of code we write,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
any of those sort of metrics. I'm kind of curious, when you said you sort of saw this evolution,
Mm-hmm.
did you have a personal moment or a personal experience that sort of led you across that chasm?
No, not necessarily. It was, I think, first driven out of necessity. You
Yeah,
know, I started my company in the most expensive real estate space in the world in San Francisco, right? I,
yeah,
started it out of not a garage, but a one-bedroom apartment. And, you just like, hey, I can offer you an office, right? And so
that's right.
out of that one, you ended up having to go remote, but then you saw really quick that this works. And for me, what I thought was really special, and it still shows in our business, for example, is that I realized, man, some of the best talent you find in regions that aren't in the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you get great talent for a lot less of the cost. And at that time, I couldn't afford it.
That's right.
So, for example, we're still helping people these days with recruiting what we call EM, or engagement managers, which is basically a souped up form of it's basically a hybrid between an EA and a chief of staff. And we still find some of the best people in rural America.
Yes.
Who can basically do the job better for, let's say, 75 to 90K than somebody who would cost 180K to 200K plus equity in the Bay Area.
That's
so
right.
That drove me to that. But basically the thing that then happened is that there is once you've learned the way of doing it, and I think this is one of the things that we're not seeing, and people haven't hopped on over it. They haven't quite embraced it. Once you embrace it, you get to basically, you have to force yourself to find ways to work with each other that are efficient, and that figuring out requires effort and energy, and that's challenging for a lot of people. And they say, why would I do it? It would be so much easier to sit across the cubicle from that person.
Right.
But once you do it, it's built in, and then I think you end up being a lot more effective, a lot more efficient. I would argue most people in my organization would not go to an office anymore.
I think that's exactly right. I think you stumbled on such a really good point, which is necessity drives us to question the heuristics that we've grown up with. And heuristics are such a powerful machine that sometimes we aren't even aware of them, right? You have this implicit feeling that somebody in a certain geography or with a certain background might have more skills or be more adept. And we are all, aligned to think with that heuristic that, it's going to be so much easier to find talent in places of density like San Francisco, as opposed to how hard might it be. And the reality is that we don't know until we're forced to do it. And you asked about why this turmoil still occurs. The turmoil still occurs because one of the reasons is we somehow, as an economy, we actually did quite well during the pandemic. And I don't think people, at least at the corporate level, really understood that a change is needed. And maybe there's going to, we had certainly a lot of companies that were forced to make a change and discovered, oh my goodness, there's amazing talent. Oh my goodness, we can actually work remotely. But sometimes these things take multiple cataclysmic events before you can see a big shift, and certainly that's one of those. If there's only the pandemic has been so awful, but if it gives us the gift of understanding that talent can be anywhere, I think that we might be able to redeem something from this horrible experience.
Yes. All right, so we kind of already touched on this notion of talent, and that's, of course, a big topic that I wanted to talk to you about because of what you chose to do. But before we do that, I do have one last question on this topic that we were residing on. That is that I think we made it very clear that you, and I'm with you on that one, believe that you shouldn't treat people as infants.
That's right.
But what's the opposite of that? Like, what do you then? We talked about what not to do. What do you do? And if you can give that to us and our audience in as pragmatic as a term, like as possible, like how does it look in day-to-day life? What do you recommend doing? Obviously, I think you're going to lead to let people work remotely, but beyond that, what else do you do to basically treat people as grown-ups in the organizations you want to lead?
Well, there's a lot. There's you have to systematically build an organization that and I think Netflix put this really well when they said so much of our even vocabulary around how we operate in our society is we're a family. And companies like Netflix came out and said, we're not a family. We're a professional sports team. We are a group of highly qualified individuals who are going to achieve a great outcome together. And we're going to treat people like they're star agents, like they're star players, that they're going to come in, they're going to be pinch hitters. There's going to be, I don't know enough sports metaphors. I'm going to that's kind of the end of my sports analogy right there. Well, I know cricket, but that's not going to resonate with most audiences. But it is it is that you reframe the equation to say we're here because we choose to be here, and we're here because we choose to work on a problem together that we're interested in, that we're motivated by. I'm still struggling with this, and this drives into a whole range of areas. I'm still struggling with even the way we define OKRs in our company and across, because by definition they become very tactical very quickly, when really we should be. There's this idea that you pay people for your time, and then the evolution of that, the second degree of that is, I want people to do. I don't care how long people take, or how long, what they work, as long as they get the job done. But who even describes what the job is, or how much the job is? What is the unit of work? And I think there's a third degree of evolution, which is, I want people to achieve the mission of the organization and align themselves to the mission of the organization and do whatever much it takes or little it takes to achieve that. And that means a few different things. For us, it means, being really ruthless about meetings and not having too many meetings, because nothing infantilizes people as much as having pointless meetings, especially having status meetings. Going around a room and asking people for their status, you're inevitably saying that somebody who is receiving the status update is more important than somebody who is delivering the status update. I hate meetings, and I hate status meetings. I think every meeting should be ultimately about learning or decision. And the symmetry of preparation for a meeting should have nothing to do with the hierarchy, which is, I as the CEO must be just as prepared. Go ahead, Patrick.
No, I want to just sum up what you're saying, and then you can tell me if I got it right. Like, what you're saying is very simple. To be a human first leader, focus on getting your company to have as least as possible meetings, or use meetings only where the modality of a meeting is exactly the right methodology of solving the problem you're trying to solve.
That's exactly right.
Into a company culture that uses a much broader set of modalities to solve the problems that aren't always synchronous meetings, but other things. And build up a culture. So being human first leader is build up a culture where not the default answer is, oh, let's have a meeting.
That's exactly right. And part of the way you do that is by enforcing an enormous amount of preparation. For us, it's having a lot of pre-reads, not having presentations in the meeting, but having people do the preparation up front. Whether it's a one-on-one, whether it's a group meeting, whether it's the CEO or whether it's a very junior person, everyone needs to prepare for it to be a productive use of time. And if you're showing up expecting to do well, regardless, I think then it's not a very good meeting to begin with. And I think that's where we conflate. Having fewer meetings, what it does for your team is it opens up time to do deep creative thinking, do deep work. And one of the reasons I think corporates, and corporate leaders are like, let's go back to the work, is because they feel like in a remote environment, there's no opportunity for creative collaboration. But part of the reason that is, it's correlated. Part of the reason that is because what they did was we went into a remote environment where we just packed our calendar with meetings after meetings. And we asked ourselves, creativity went out the window. And maybe creativity went out the windows because we didn't actually budget and create the room for people to do real deep work. And so we then rely on the water cooler conversation that people keep coming back to, where creativity can happen. Well, that's not the only way creativity can happen. It's not even a very good way.
Okay, so let me sum that up. Another advice you have is basically to make your organization more human first is to make it not just accepted, but almost mandated that the balance of your use of time has a certain percentage, be it 10, 50, maybe even 20% of proactive thinking time.
I'd say 50%. Okay. I'd say the more senior you are, the more, and the other mistake companies make is the more senior you are, the more meetings you have. And I actually think it's almost the opposite. The more senior you are, the more decisions you have, like the more important the decisions you have, and you should be very, very deliberate about them. So I try to strive for no more than half my calendar is filled with meetings. And I get very annoyed if the people who work with me are so jam-packed in meetings that they don't have the ability to sort of do deep thinking.
I mean, I think you're not alone. Like one of the things we see in our coaching is that is a urging that almost every single client of ours has. And the way we answered it through a concept called Whitespace Time, in which we basically say, look, you need to have a certain amount of Whitespace Time that is just there to do deep thinking. And by the way, doing deep thinking requires you to actually take a little bit of a step to reconfigure your brain to be ready for it. Because if you've been in meetings all day long and then you do deep thinking, your brain is conditioned to be reactive.
That's right.
And when you're doing deep thinking, you need to be proactive. Reactive is easy because you have to react to things that come. And
That's
so
right.
it becomes natural, but proactive is actually effort. And that's why a lot of people end up not doing it. And this concept of white space time is exactly that. And so what I'm hearing you say is not only the senior team, but basically almost any member of the company should have a certain amount of this deep thinking budget time, call it white space time or whatever else. And enforcing that or bringing that to the organization on a cultural level is a human first leadership in your eyes.
And if they don't, it's an opportunity for the organization to think about what is going wrong that is creating that scenario. Like, is it a lack of resourcing in certain areas? Is it a creep of priorities? All of those we have to interrogate when people don't have that kind of time.
I could use the next hour and basically drill more and more of those types of examples out of you. And I think everybody listening right now would actually enjoy it. But we have this other topic that I really want to hear more about. And I'll start with a little bit of an experience that we have here at Mindmaven. And that is that, as I mentioned earlier, we have a recruiting business where we help people find amazing EAs that we then help turn into this concept of an EM. And we've developed over the years a very structured, very almost like scientific approach to recruiting these people to basically be able to say, yeah, this person will work out. We've gotten really good at it. But what I've learned through that process, or what we've learned through the process, is that one of the things we look least at is actually their resume and what they've done and so on and so forth. And I think that resonates, or that's not, that experience is basically backing up why you started Datapeople. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's one of the reasons. Like, we started Datapeople because I had a single...
To tell everybody here what it is and what you do and what the premise is of what makes recruiting more fair in the way you're doing it.
Well, Datapeople, we're all about bringing science to hiring. The problem with hiring is it's filled with heuristics. And most of the investment in hiring has gone into the candidate problem. How do we get you more candidates? How do we get you better candidates? How do we get you 1% candidates? And I think that's an important problem for some companies to solve. But not enough investment has happened into what is the process of hiring and where do we create structural impediments because of our own heuristics and biases that either make the process less efficient and often make the process less fair. And it shows up in different areas. We might write a job a certain way because the hiring manager has always written a job a certain way without consideration that how does a candidate react to the job? And how do we get the hiring manager to write a calibrated job description, not just a stock standard job description? How do we then interrogate the whole process to make sure that we're moving candidates along fairly, we're moving candidates along thoughtfully? How are we building the right rubrics across the process? So what Datapeople does is we have tools from helping a job writing tool to analytics tools that help you interrogate your heuristics, biases, and bottlenecks across your hiring process and make them better.
Like loosening them up and basically letting you change your perspective in such a way that you end up looking for what you really need and not looking for something that how do you call it? Heuristics? Your heuristics is driving you to look for.
That's exactly right. Like we treat hiring processes, a little sloppily, and for a few reasons. Like we outsource them to recruiters and hope for the best when hiring is very much a team sport. We have certain visions, like one of the classic things that companies do when they use our platform the first time is they'll like do what they always do. They'll write a job title that is internal instead of external facing. They'll overqualify the job, and then they'll wonder why they're not getting, you know, they're not getting a representation of talent, why they're not getting great talent. And it's actually counterintuitive. When you look at the data, when you overqualify a job, you don't get more qualified candidates. You actually get less qualified candidates. You actually get, and you get 50% fewer women and underrepresented candidates applying. You end up with lots and lots of little impediments for candidates along the way. And to me, my personal mission is I want to live in a world where anyone who posts it, applies for a job cold can get a job, but has the same chances of getting that job as somebody who came in through a referral or through a privileged network. Because the truth is, talent is everywhere, and you'll be surprised at the incredible amount of talent that's applying for jobs cold. And too often we privilege sources, we privilege referrals, we privilege certain types of backgrounds and sourcing for no good reason than our own bias that we think that talent pool is better, and it isn't.
Yeah, so tell me this. I mean, obviously, that's connected to the topic of human first, and obviously achieving that makes basically anybody in the talent pool have a much fairer chance, no matter what access they have or not, how much
that's right
they have or not. So that is clearly human first. But let's take a look at the hiring manager. Why do you recommend for a hiring manager to actually do this?
Because it works better. It actually we often think that our gut instinct is designed to serve our interests. And over time, behavioral economics and research have proven that sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not true. And I think the large part of the problem is that we don't realize that they're not in hiring often. These gut instincts aren't serving our interests. They're actually going the other way. It means that the jobs take longer to fill. It means that the jobs are more frustrating. We actually get, fewer qualified candidates in the pipe. We actually end up spending a lot more time and effort trying to hire this person. There's more chances of dissonance in between your salary expectations and the candidate salary expectations. So I think, to me, it's not a trade-off between efficiency and fairness. In fact, this is one of the few things we can do that efficiency and fairness are extraordinarily aligned. And hiring managers should do this. So we think about it as calibration. We're not pandering. We're not pandering to certain types of candidates or demographics. But what we want to make sure is, by interrogating our own biases and replacing them with data, can we build highly performant hiring processes that actually get candidates through the funnel much faster, get more qualified candidates? And because they're highly performant, they actually, one dimension of high performance is, are you ending up with better representation in that talent pipeline?
Yeah, okay. And I would argue that it has a very profound long tail behind it, because if you end up hiring the right person, and that person is really thrilled about this role because it is a really good fit, that person, onboards faster, becomes faster, and probably develops a much longer lasting sense of loyalty, or like it has a inverse impact on attrition in that sense.
That's exactly right. It has an inverse impact on attrition, but also if you then end up with all of these companies implicitly understand, and we've seen lots and lots and lots of studies that say diverse populations build better products, they build better systems, because they can, when you have a diverse organization, it's almost like it's anti-fragile, right? You're coming at it.
Let me make sure that I get that jump. You basically said, what you're saying is, because if you operate in that way, a outcome that is maybe not directly asked for, but almost inevitable, is that the people you end up hiring will be by definition more diverse, because you're not relying on heuristics and other biases as much as you had done before. You are still getting a more performant team together that is actually more diverse. And then a side benefit of that is first of all, you have a diverse team, which a lot of people are aspiring for, but it's actually also going to be a more performant team all over.
That's exactly right. Yeah. One of the things we studied was, when people do referrals, they're much more likely to refer in groups. So men are twice as likely to refer other men than they were likely to refer women. Now, if you imagine that you're in an organization that's 80% men, that's not unheard of because you look at a lot of tech companies and there's very predominantly men. They all want to diversify. They want to get more women engineers. They want to get more women talent across the organization because they understand the long-term societal and economic benefits of building diverse organizations. But if they're hiring in a privileged way, then you're just creating a self-fulfilling loop where you hire in a way that ultimately privileges referrals. You start to kind of build more of that in network. And you think about, instead of women, you say, people from Ivy League educations or, people from FANG backgrounds, whatever your heuristic is, they all reinforce in the same way.
Yes. All right. So there's one thought that I had that is very macro, but probably very, I'm curious if you agree with this, but I have this feeling that we're actually entering a future where the way we, for example, educate is fundamentally changing. I believe that, for example, we're going to see a sharp increase in the percentage of people that you can hire that are self-educated. That, for example, learn what they had to do by going to YouTube, as an example.
Maybe.
Like, and I think the big schools are already feeling that pressure. We have, of course, people running around giving other people $100,000 to drop out of school because they think it's not the right thing. So we're going to have a much more broader reality that basically the best talent you can find isn't just going to be under the 5 top school graduates type of thing, but basically you can find them anywhere. And the way you will identify if they are the right one is through different variables. And so in many ways, what you're saying is that you're just spearheading something that is inevitable anyway, if you want to become or stay relevant as a highly performant recruiting manager, like somebody who hires and recruits great teams, which, by the way, is the only way you'll ever be successful. Because
that's exactly right.
Never ever achieve your fullest potential without actually getting other people convinced to follow you on the path that you're doing. And that's not just true for founders and CEOs, but for department heads and even middle management.
That's exactly right.
And so forth. And so now, beyond this, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying you're hitting the nail on the head. Like, forward-thinking hiring managers want to build these highly performant teams. But there's one other variable in there, is even if you're in an organization that has forward-thinking recruiting teams and forward-thinking hiring managers, we're all trying to do this. We're often stymied by backwards-looking systems and processes that reinforce the old ways. For recruiting processes to be truly human first, we've as a society, we've learned a lot about the candidate experience being important. We must be empathetic to candidates, but for human sort of first recruiting to happen, we also have to worry about the hiring manager experience. And a lot of the tools in our industry, and maybe you've used tools in recruiting as well, from applicant tracking systems to others, are actively user hostile. They're not designed for collaboration. They're not designed for teamwork. And hiring, if there's one thing about hiring, the one thing it is it's teamwork.
Collaborative, yeah.
It is collaborative. And so that's where, we found that actually the hearts and minds are evolving a lot faster than the tooling seems to be evolving in our space.
Okay, so let's wrap this up and bring it together to this notion of human first, because that's what we're here to talk about. And I'll go back to the first part of our conversation saying, hey, you said that you spend time thinking, have deep thinking time. And by doing that and offering that also up to your team, you become a more human first leader. One of the things you now just told us is use some of that deep thinking time to be absolutely proactive and take the genesis of a job description as a deep thinking effort.
That's right.
And through that process, actually lay the foundation of a much more robust and much more efficient recruiting process that, as a subsequent consequence, is also going to be more fair and leads to more diversity. And therefore, doing those things is also basically one of the things you believe is the most profound way of being a human first leader. And the most important thing I want to say about this is that it's not you shouldn't just do it to be a human first leader, because I argue many people that listen to us are attracted to this notion. But what we're really saying is it leads you to be a long-term, short-term and long-term, way more performant leader, because you start learning through investing into this way of recruiting to build teams that are way more robust than any other path you can take. And that basically lets you be not just a human first leader, but also one of the most profound, performant, successful leaders out there. Is that a fair summary of what you said?
That was really well put. That's a beautiful summary.
Well, good. Well, then, Amit, I thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I've loved this conversation, and I hope we'll hear a lot from our audience that they felt inspired, because I think you really came in with a bunch of new ideas that aren't that new, but is a new perspective on something where maybe our world is going to. And I personally hope it does go there, because I think it'll be a better world.
A more interesting world, at least. But Patrick, thank you for spearheading one of the most important topics in modern leadership. So I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on your show.